For nearly 2,000 years, the muddy northern shoreline of the Sea of Galilee kept a secret buried beneath silt, reeds, and the slow drift of centuries. Somewhere along that shore stood a fishing village the Gospels called Bethsaida, the birthplace of three of Jesus's closest disciples, Peter, Andrew, and Philip. And somewhere in that same soil lay a message that no biblical author ever thought to write down, a line of devotion carved not in scripture, but in stone and glass, waiting 15 centuries to be read again. This is the story of how that message resurfaced, and why a single circle of black tiles on a forgotten church floor has archaeologists calling it one of the most significant New Testament discoveries of the century. Long before it appeared in any gospel, Bethsaida was nothing more than a modest cluster of homes on the water. Its name in the local Aramaic meant roughly, house of fishing or house of hunters, a fitting label for a community that lived and worked by the lake. Nets were mended on its shore, boats came and went with the day's catch, and life moved at the unhurried pace of a first-century fishing settlement. It was here, according to the Gospel of John, that Philip, Andrew, and Peter came from, men whose ordinary lives as fishermen were interrupted by an encounter that would eventually reshape the ancient world. Around 30 AD, the regional ruler Philip the Tetrarch elevated the village to the status of a city, renaming it Julius in honor of the Roman emperor's mother. It was no longer just a fishing hamlet. It had become a proper Greco-Roman polis. The Gospels remember Bethsaida for more than its famous sons. Tradition holds that Jesus healed a blind man just outside its limits and performed the miracle of feeding a multitude with only 5 loaves and 2 fish somewhere near its shore. And yet the town is also remembered for judgment. Jesus is recorded rebuking Bethsaida for its lack of faith despite witnessing these very wonders. It is, in scripture, a place of both blessing and disappointment. Then it vanished. Not overnight, but gradually, swallowed by floods, shifting shorelines, and the slow erasure that time inflicts on unguarded places. For centuries, no one could say with certainty where Bethsaida had actually stood. The first real thread pointing toward an answer came not from an archaeologist, but from a pilgrim. In the early 700s, a Bavarian bishop named Willibald traveled through the Holy Land, retracing the steps of the Gospels. Passing between Capernaum and Corsi, he noted that he had stayed the night in a place identified to him as Bethsaida. More importantly, he recorded something specific, that a church now stood where the house of Peter and Andrew once had been. It was a small detail in a much longer travel account, but it would become one of the most important clues in a mystery that wouldn't be solved for over 1,000 years. For most of that time, scholars simply argued over geography. 2 candidate sites emerged on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. El-Araj, an inland location with impressive Iron Age fortifications, and El-Araj, a site sitting almost directly on the water. The debate was not trivial. A fishing village, by definition, needed to be near the water. El-Araj sat roughly 1.5 miles from the current shoreline, a strange distance for a town whose very name meant house of fishing. But proponents of El-Araj pointed to its older, more visually dramatic remains and argued that lake levels and shifting deltas could explain the distance. For decades, neither side could produce anything decisive enough to end the argument. That changed with a systematic excavation of El-Araj beginning in 2016, led by Professor Mordecai Avium of the Kinneret Institute for Galilean Archaeology, working alongside Professor R. Stephen Notley of Nyack College. Their early seasons uncovered the upper layers of the site, a large Byzantine-era church with mosaic flooring, dating roughly to the 5th through 7th centuries. Promising, but not yet proof of anything from the time of Jesus. The real turning point came as the team dug deeper, past roughly 40 centimeters of loose silt left behind by ancient flooding of the Jordan River. Beneath that mud, they hit something different. A layer of occupation dating squarely to the Roman period, the world of the 1st century. What followed, season after season, was a steady accumulation of evidence. Pottery shards and coins helped anchor the layer firmly between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. Among the finds was a small silver denarius minted under the Emperor Nero around 65 or 66 AD, physical proof that people were living and trading at the site during the exact era described in the Gospels. Then came the everyday objects that tell the truest stories. Fragments of Herodian oil lamps turned up in the soil, lamps with a distinctive knife-paired design that, at the time, were produced almost exclusively in Jerusalem during the Second Temple period. Their presence this far north strongly suggested a Jewish population living at the site during Jesus' lifetime, not a later Roman settlement built on top of an unrelated community. And then, the fishing evidence. Hundreds of lead weights used to sink fishing nets, scattered throughout the excavation squares, along with a chalk limestone mold used to cast those same weights. In effect, the archaeologists had found a small manufacturing operation for fishing gear, sitting exactly where a village called House of Fishing ought to have one. Finally, adjacent to a Roman period wall, the team uncovered a black and white mosaic floor along with fragments of clay brick and ceramic piping, the unmistakable remains of a Roman bathhouse. Bathhouses were not features of small rural villages. They were markers of urban Greco-Roman life, the kind of amenity you'd expect in a settlement that had been formally elevated to the status of a city. It matched, almost perfectly, the historical account of Philip the Tetrarch transforming humble Bethsaida into the grander city of Julius. To the excavation team, the bathhouse wasn't just an interesting find. It was a strong signal that they were no longer digging up just any ancient settlement. They appeared to be standing inside the lost city described in the Gospels. By 2019, the accumulated evidence, the fishing weights, the Herodian lamps, the Nero coin, the bathhouse, had already built a compelling case. But that year brought something that connected the physical dig directly to Willibald's 13th-century-old travel account. Excavators uncovered the remains of a large Byzantine basilica, complete with well-preserved mosaic floors, fragments of a marble chancel screen carved with a wreath motif, and dozens of small gilded glass tesserae, the kind used to create shimmering wall mosaics inside a church. The team identified this structure as a strong candidate for the long-described Church of the Apostles, the very building Willibald had written about in the 8th century, said to have been built over the house of Peter and Andrew. Then, in 2022, came the discovery that Notley himself described as the true breakthrough. Beneath the floor of the diaconicon, the sacristy, or preparation room, of the basilica, the team uncovered a mosaic floor bearing a Greek inscription, framed inside a round medallion made of 2 lines of black glass tiles. The inscription named a donor, Constantine, described as the servant of Christ. But it was the second half of the text that mattered most. It offered a prayer invoking the intercession of a figure it called the Chief and Commander of the Heavenly Apostles, a formal title that Byzantine Christian writers routinely used to refer to Peter. Nowhere in the New Testament itself is Peter described in quite those terms. The Gospels present him as a leader among equals, impulsive, devoted, occasionally faltering, but never given an explicit title of supreme command. What Scripture does record is Jesus telling Peter that he would hold the keys of the kingdom of heaven, a symbolic grant of real spiritual authority. By the time the Byzantine Church rose over Bethsaida centuries later, that authority had been formalized into exactly the kind of grand title etched into the sacristy floor. For Notley and his colleagues, finding that phrase in a church built, according to long tradition, directly over what was remembered as Peter's own home was about as close to confirmation as archaeology usually allows. It didn't prove, in a legal sense, that Peter had lived on that exact spot. But it strongly reinforced that the Byzantine community, which built this basilica, believed he had, and structured their entire church around that memory. Excavations beneath the church later revealed a wall belonging to an earlier, 1st-century house buried under the basilica's apse, physical evidence that something predating the church, and matching the right time period, existed at precisely the spot the later Christians chose to venerate. Not everyone accepted El-Araj as the final word. For years, the leading skeptic was Ramirov, chief excavator at the rival Et Tel site, who argued that his probes at El-Araj had turned up no clear evidence of 1st-century occupation. As the seasons progressed and the fishing weights, Herodian lamps, Nero coin, and bathhouse accumulated, that specific argument became difficult to sustain, and Urav eventually acknowledged that El-Araj had indeed been occupied during the right period. His objection shifted instead to what kind of occupation it was. He suggested it might have been a temporary Roman military encampment rather than a civilian fishing village. The El-Araj team countered that the sheer volume of fishing equipment, together with an actual mold for producing lead weights, points far more convincingly to an economy built around fishing than one built around soldiering. Other critics questioned whether the excavated area was simply too small to represent a settlement that had once been elevated to full city status. In response, the team expanded their dig in 2018 and 2019, opening new excavation areas dozens of meters away from the original bathhouse trench. Both new areas produced Roman-era structures almost immediately, suggesting a settlement considerably larger than the original excavation footprint implied. A third objection proposed that any Roman-era material at El-Araj might simply have washed downhill from the higher, older site of El during flooding. That theory grew harder to defend once excavators uncovered an intact bathhouse complete with mosaic flooring and ceramic piping, structures that do not travel downhill in a flood. Notably, no Iron Age material from El has ever turned up at El-Araj either, which undercuts the washdown theory further. In July 2025, a wildfire swept along the reserve bordering the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, destroying equipment the excavation team had stored on site. What initially looked like a disaster turned into an unexpected gift. The fire stripped away decades, possibly longer, of dense vegetation and invasive eucalyptus growth that had obscured large sections of the surrounding land. When the team returned and conducted a fresh ground survey, they realized El-Araj was considerably larger than previously understood. Newly visible remains included private houses and architectural elements typical of public buildings, pillar drums and decorative capitals among them, consistent with descriptions the ancient historian Josephus gave of Bethsaida Julius as a genuine settlement, not merely a lakeside outpost. Remarkably, the flames that consumed nearby vegetation stopped short of the Byzantine basilica itself, leaving the structure the team associates with Peter's house untouched. The pattern uncovered at El-Araj is strikingly similar to one found decades earlier at Capernaum, another Galilean fishing town associated with Jesus' ministry, just across the lake. There, archaeologists in the late 1960s discovered a simple first-century home beneath a Byzantine church, a home whose walls had been plastered over and inscribed with pilgrim graffiti invoking the names of Jesus and Peter, evidence that it had transitioned from an ordinary house into a gathering space for early worship well before any formal church was built on top of it. Today, a modern octagonal church with a glass floor lets visitors look directly down into those Capernaum ruins. At El-Araj, no such glass floor exists yet. The story is still being excavated, one season at a time. But the underlying pattern, a first-century home transformed first into an informal house of worship and later enclosed by a Byzantine basilica, appears to be repeating itself on the opposite shore. It's worth being precise about what was found. The mosaic medallion at El-Araj does not record a saying of Jesus that was somehow left out of Scripture. What it preserves is something quieter and, in its own way, just as significant, proof that a Byzantine Christian community, centuries after the Gospels were written, built and decorated an entire church around the belief that this exact patch of shoreline had been Peter's home, and that they invoked him not as a fisherman, but as the chief and commander of the apostles, a title Scripture itself never uses. That's the message the church never recorded in writing but preserved in stone, a devotion to Peter so specific and so geographically anchored that it survived floods, silt, centuries of abandonment, and, this past year, even a wildfire. The excavation continues. Avium and Notley's team plans further seasons digging beneath the church floor toward the Roman layer, hoping to settle the debate with El once and for all. If the pattern from Capernaum holds, there may be more waiting beneath El-Araj soil than anyone has yet uncovered, perhaps even the walls of the house itself, still resting exactly where a fisherman named Peter once called home.